close your eyes and drift back to a world lit only by firelight. The year is somewhere in the Middle Ages, an age of kings and plagues, of prayers whispered to the heavens and secrets buried in the soil. But beneath the surface of medieval life, behind the heavy church doors and thatched roofs, there was another world, one where people sought to feel something more, to forget the hunger, the fear, the endless labor, to touch the divine, or maybe just to escape. This is the story of what getting high was really like in medieval times. Before we dive into the strange brews, the forbidden herbs, and the mystical potions of the past, take a moment to get comfortable. You're here with History for Sleep, where we explore the forgotten corners of history in a calm, soothing way to help your mind rest while your imagination drifts. If you haven't yet, take a second to subscribe. It helps this channel grow and lets us bring you more relaxing stories from the past. And as you listen, tell us in the comments what parts of history you'd like to dream about next, and when you like to listen. Do you drift off as soon as the medieval world begins, or do you stay awake, lost in the details of another time? Because the truth is, humans have always searched for escape. Whether it was a goblet of ale after a long day in the fields, a monk brewing mysterious tonics in candlelight, or a witch stirring her flying ointment beneath the moon, people in the Middle Ages were no strangers to altered states. They didn't call it getting high, but they knew what it meant to slip away from pain, to see visions, or to feel the world grow distant. In this journey, we'll uncover the strange, beautiful, and sometimes terrifying ways medieval people experimented with mind and body. From opium carried along ancient trade routes to potions that made villagers believe they could fly, this was a world both familiar and foreign. So settle in. Let the sounds of the past fill your imagination, and allow your mind to wander through the smoke, the song, and the silence of the medieval high. Now, let's begin our story with the forgotten highs of history. In the medieval world, the idea of getting high was not something people would describe in the way we understand it today. There were no neon signs advertising taverns, no labels warning of side effects, and no clear line between medicine, poison, and pleasure. To live in the Middle Ages was to exist in a world where nearly everything that touched the senses could alter the mind. The air smelled of wood smoke and incense. The streets were filled with the scent of ale and herbs, and people lived in constant contact with the natural world. To them, intoxication was a mystery, sometimes divine and sometimes dangerous, but always present. In this time, knowledge of the body and the spirit was bound together. If a potion calmed the nerves or eased pain, it was seen as a blessing, even if it carried strange effects. The medieval mind did not separate the physical from the spiritual as we do now. To feel altered, to see visions, or to drift into a dreamlike state might mean that one had touched something beyond the mortal world. It could be a sign from God or a whisper from something darker. Every drink, every herb, every scent had meaning, and people believed that the natural world held both healing and temptation in its grasp. Travelers brought stories of strange substances from distant lands. From the east came talk of powders and resins that could bring deep calm or wild dreams. Merchants returning from the Silk Road carried spices, incense, and sometimes mysterious substances that European scholars struggled to understand. They mixed them into potions, sometimes for medicine, sometimes for mystery. The medieval apothecary was both healer and alchemist, balancing between science and sorcery. The line between relief and revelation was thin, but most people didn't need exotic ingredients to experience their own kind of high. For the peasant working the fields, a mug of strong ale at the end of the day could bring laughter and warmth that made the hardships fade. For a monk alone in his cell, hours of chanting and fasting could lead to moments of pure ecstasy, a spiritual high that felt as real as any earthly intoxication. And for the mystics and visionaries of the time, to see visions was not madness, but divine connection. It's easy to imagine medieval life as simple and dull, but in truth, it was filled with sensory experiences that could lift, dull, or distort the mind. Fumes from poorly ventilated hearths, herbal brews shared at festivals, or the burning of strange incenses in churches all played a role in shaping how people felt and saw the world. Some effects were intentional, others were accidental. Yet all of them remind us how deeply connected the medieval person was to the substances that surrounded them. In a world without modern science, people trusted what they could feel. A warm rush in the body was proof that something worked. A spinning head or a vivid dream was evidence that nature held power. And in this world of mystery, where knowledge was guarded by the church and superstition guided the heart, these experiences became stories. Tales of transformation, temptation, and transcendence spread from village to village, weaving together the strange relationship between humanity and intoxication. The forgotten highs of history were not simply about escape. They were about survival, belief, and wonder. Each drink, each herb, and each ritual carried both promise and danger. The medieval mind walked a fine line between the sacred and the sinful, between healing and harm. And as we step further into this journey, we will discover that the ways people sought to change their minds in the Middle Ages were not just acts of indulgence, but reflections of their deepest fears and desires. Next, we'll explore one of the most familiar and universal of these experiences, the intoxicating world of ale and mead, where even the simplest drink could lead to moments of joy, chaos, and transformation. To understand what getting high meant in medieval times, you first have to understand how deeply alcohol shaped daily life. Water was often unsafe to drink, teeming with bacteria that could make people sick. Ale, wine, and mead, on the other hand, were considered not only safer, but almost necessary for survival. Even children drank watered-down ale. It was a constant companion from sunrise to sunset, a mild but persistent haze that wrapped around medieval society like a fog. For the peasants who toiled from dawn to dusk, ale was more than a drink. It was comfort, nourishment, and brief escape. After long days in the fields, they would gather in smoky taverns or around small fires to share mugs of the thick, cloudy brew. Medieval ale wasn't like the crisp beers of today. It was dense, often sweet, with bits of grain still floating in it. It was made in homes, monasteries, and small village breweries. Sometimes it was weak, just strong enough to dull the thirst, but other times it was potent enough to make the world spin. People laughed louder, sang longer, and for a few hours forgot the weight of their labor and the uncertainty of their lives. Mead was the drink of celebration. Honey, water, and yeast transformed into golden intoxication. It was the taste of festivals and feasts, weddings and harvests. Mead carried an air of warmth and joy, but it also carried myth. In Norse and Celtic traditions, it was said to bring wisdom or poetry to those who drank it, a kind of divine inspiration that blurred the line between intoxication and enlightenment. Even in the Christian Middle Ages, the echoes of those older beliefs lingered. To drink deeply was not only to dull pain, but to open oneself to something mysterious and ancient. The tavern was the beating heart of social life, though it was also a place of chaos. Singing, shouting, and brawling were common. The alehouse was where gossip spread faster than fire, and where laughter could turn to argument in a heartbeat. Chroniclers often complained about drunkenness, calling it one of the great sins of the common folk. The church warned that ale led to sloth and sin, but even the clergy often indulged. Monks brewed their own beer, carefully refining recipes that would one day become the foundation of many modern European ales. Their work in stone-walled breweries was both craft and contemplation, a ritual that blurred the line between devotion and indulgence. Yet the medieval relationship with alcohol wasn't just about celebration. It was also about survival. Ale and wine were safer than water, and in a world without refrigeration, fermentation was a way to preserve calories. Drinking was not simply recreation. It was part of daily life. Even so, the side effects, the laughter, the loosened tongues, the hazy warmth, became woven into the rhythm of existence. For many, that mild buzz was the only reliable comfort in a harsh world. There were, of course, those who went too far. Chroniclers described the drunkard as a figure of ridicule, stumbling, foolish, and doomed. Drunkenness could lead to fines, imprisonment, or public shame. Some towns even had stocks reserved for those who could not hold their drink. Yet despite the warnings, despite the sermons about sin and excess, the love of ale endured. It was too deeply tied to daily life, too comforting, too human to abandon. The medieval world was full of contradictions. The same monks who preached temperance brewed potent beer. The same nobles who lectured peasants about morality filled their tables with imported wines. Alcohol was the great equalizer. It blurred class lines, loosened speech, and revealed truths that were often hidden in sober daylight. And in the soft glow of torchlight, as voices rose in laughter and song, people found a kind of freedom they could not find anywhere else. This was the first and most common high of the Middle Ages, not exotic, not forbidden, but deeply human. It was a way to soften the world's sharp edges, to bring warmth to the cold, and to remind one another that life, however hard, could still be tasted and shared. But beyond the taverns and the laughter, there was another kind of intoxication brewing, one that mixed faith with chemistry, devotion with indulgence. Deep inside the monasteries, monks were experimenting with recipes that would shape the future of drink and medicine alike. In the next chapter, we'll enter their quiet, candlelit world, where brewing was not just craft, but holy work. Inside the cool stone walls of monasteries, where time moved at the slow pace of prayer and bells, another kind of alchemy was taking place. The monks of medieval Europe were not only guardians of faith, but also keepers of knowledge. They copied ancient texts, cultivated herbs, and brewed drinks that would nourish both body and soul. For them, brewing was an act of devotion, a ritual that transformed the simple gifts of creation into something greater. Yet within those humble vessels and copper cauldrons, monks discovered elixirs that did far more than quench thirst. Some brought warmth, others clarity, and a few could lift the spirit to unexpected heights. Beer and ale brewed by monks were often richer and more refined than what common folk drank. The monasteries had access to better ingredients, clean water from wells, carefully chosen grains, and secret blends of herbs that flavored their brews. They worked with patience, perfecting fermentation techniques and recording results as though documenting a prayer. Their goal was sustenance, but over time, their skill gave birth to something remarkable. The monastery brews became famous for their purity and strength, known not just as food, but as a form of medicine. Monks believed that every plant had a divine purpose. They gathered herbs from monastery gardens, drying them carefully and adding them to their drinks in measured amounts. Some were meant to ease digestion or soothe the nerves. Others were intended to calm the spirit during long nights of prayer, but the effects were often stronger than intended. Certain herbs, like wormwood, henbane, or mandrake, had intoxicating or hallucinogenic properties. Taken in the right amount, they could bring vivid dreams or strange sensations of floating and lightness. Too much, and they could bring confusion, even danger. In those quiet cloisters, the line between spiritual enlightenment and chemical intoxication was sometimes as thin as a breath. It wasn't only beer that monks brewed. They created tinctures, cordials, and fortified wines infused with roots, spices, and resins. These were often called elixirs of health, meant to cure aches or drive away melancholy. Some of these recipes survive today, their descendants known as herbal liqueurs like chartreuse and benedictine. To drink them was to taste centuries of experimentation, the blending of faith, science, and sensory pleasure. During fasts, when monks could not eat solid food, beer became their sustenance. They called it liquid bread, but in truth, it did more than nourish. It dulled hunger and quieted the restless mind. Some monks found that the long hours of chanting and fasting, combined with the warm haze of ale, led to states of deep contemplation or even visions. To an outside observer, it might have looked like drunkenness, but to those who experienced it, it felt like communion with the divine. The intoxication of the spirit and the intoxication of the body had become one. Despite their vows of moderation, the monks were not blind to pleasure. Many took joy in their craft, refining their brews as carefully as they tended their souls. Brewing was art, science, and service all at once. It brought income to the monastery and reputation to its name. Travelers who stayed in monastic guest houses often left speaking of the remarkable drink that seemed to bring peace after only a few sips. It was no wonder that many monasteries became known as sanctuaries not only for prayer, but for rest, warmth, and comfort. Yet even in this world of pious intention, there was caution. The church valued discipline and feared excess. Too much indulgence, even in holy hands, was still sin. There were rules, limits, and reminders that pleasure could lead one astray. But human nature being what it is, boundaries blurred. Some monks likely drank a little too much of their own creations, drifting off in gentle stupors that must have felt, if only for a while, like divine bliss. These monastic brews laid the foundation for centuries of European drinking culture. They were the first experiments in controlled fermentation and the origin of many drinks that people still enjoy today. In the dim light of monastery halls, where hymns echoed and cauldrons steamed, the medieval world took its first steps toward modern brewing, guided by devotion, curiosity, and the quiet pursuit of transcendence. But outside those walls, beyond the order and silence of the cloister, there was another kind of intoxication taking shape. It came not from barley or honey, but from faraway lands, carried by merchants and traders along the silk roads of the East. Strange powders, sweet resins, and dark opiates began to arrive in Europe, stirring both fascination and fear. In the next chapter, we'll follow those paths to see how the medieval world first met the intoxicating power of opium and the mysteries it carried across continents. Long before the smoky taverns of Europe filled with laughter and song, long before the monks perfected their sacred brews, another kind of intoxication was making its slow, mysterious journey westward. It came along the trade routes that stitched the ancient world together, the Silk Road, that winding thread of exchange that carried more than silk and spices. It carried stories, secrets, and substances that could change the way a person saw the world. Among them was one of history's oldest and most powerful intoxicants, opium. To the people of the Middle Ages, opium was both miracle and menace. It was known to ancient civilizations long before Europe was even dreaming of cathedrals. The Egyptians, Greeks, Persians, and Arabs all used the milky sap of the poppy plant for healing and for visions. When the Crusades brought contact between East and West, European knights and scholars encountered new medicines, powders, herbs, and pastes that could numb pain or quiet the mind. These discoveries began to filter home, carried by traders and physicians who barely understood what they had found. The early medieval apothecaries treated opium as a powerful tool. Ground into powders or dissolved into tinctures, it was prescribed for sleeplessness, melancholy, and pain. In small amounts, it soothed. In larger doses, it transported. People described feeling light, calm, and detached from their bodies, as if floating between waking and dreaming. For a medieval world full of hardship, pain, and disease, it must have felt like magic. But like all magic, it carried a cost. The poppy's journey into Europe wasn't only through trade. It was also through text. Ancient medical writings, translations of works by Galen, Avicenna, and other physicians described the use of opium in careful detail. Monastic scholars studied these texts, copying them by candlelight. They treated the poppy as a gift of nature, one that must be handled with reverence and precision. But outside the monasteries, where precision was rare and measurement often guesswork, things could go wrong. Apothecaries mixed opium with wine, honey, and herbs to make concoctions that dulled pain, but sometimes stole the breath of those who drank too deeply. Still, the fascination with opium spread. It was mysterious, exotic, and powerful, everything the medieval imagination loved. To a culture steeped in faith and fear, where heaven and hell were always close at hand, the effects of opium could feel spiritual. The drifting thoughts, the visions, the melting away of pain, all seemed like glimpses of another realm. Some even believed the plant had divine origins, a flower born from the tears of gods. For the wealthy and well-connected, opium became part of a hidden luxury. Nobles who could afford rare imports from the East sometimes kept small jars of powdered poppy among their perfumes and spices. It was mixed with other substances to enhance pleasure or ease melancholy. For the poor, such indulgence was unthinkable. Their intoxication came from ale, from smoke, from song, but not from these faraway treasures. The poppy was a symbol of distance and mystery, a reminder that somewhere beyond the known world, there were lands where dreams were harvested and sold. The church viewed these strange imports with unease. Anything that changed the mind too much risked opening the soul to temptation. While opium was tolerated as medicine, it was distrusted as pleasure. Some theologians wrote that to seek unnatural calm was to defy divine suffering, to reject the purifying trials of life. Yet others saw it differently, as part of God's creation, a tool to bring mercy to the suffering. As with so many things in the medieval world, the truth depended on who was speaking and how much power they held. By the late Middle Ages, opium and its relatives had quietly woven themselves into European life. Doctors prescribed it, travelers whispered of it, and poets wrote about dreams that seemed too vivid to be natural. It remained a mystery, both feared and desired, a shadow moving silently through the corridors of history. It would take centuries before Europe fully grasped what it had invited in. But even without opium, medieval people found plenty of ways to alter their minds. The forests and fields of Europe were full of plants with strange effects, herbs that could bring visions, laughter, or madness. Some were used by healers, others by witches, and some by those who simply wanted to feel something more than the gray weight of daily life. In the next chapter, we step into that world of leaves and roots, where nature itself offered both cure and curse, the hidden garden of medieval herbal highs. Before laboratories, before chemistry, and long before anyone spoke of narcotics or psychedelics, people turned to the earth. Every meadow, forest, and field in the medieval world was a pharmacy. Herbs were life. They cured, they nourished, and sometimes they changed the mind. In an age when magic and medicine were nearly the same, these plants were believed to hold the essence of creation itself, both gift and danger. The line between a healing tonic and a hallucinogenic brew was as narrow as a single leaf, and few who used them truly understood where one ended and the other began. Medieval healers knew hundreds of plants by sight and scent. They understood which leaves could calm pain, which roots could soothe anxiety, and which berries might cause fevered dreams. These herbalists, sometimes monks, sometimes midwives, sometimes wandering wise folk, gathered plants at dawn or dusk when they believed their powers were strongest. They murmured prayers as they harvested, asking God or the spirits of nature to bless their work. Every plant had its season, and every harvest had its risk. Among the most potent of these herbs were those that touched the mind: henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and datura, plants known for their strange and dangerous effects. Taken in small doses, they could dull pain, relax muscles, or bring on deep, vivid sleep. But in larger amounts, They caused visions, confusion, and sometimes death. Henbane was said to make the drinker feel as if they were flying. Belladonna blurred the edges of the world, making faces seem distant and glowing. Mandrake, with its human-shaped root, was feared and revered in equal measure. People said that when it was pulled from the ground, it screamed, a sound so terrible it could kill anyone who heard it. Yet when dried and prepared with care, it could bring euphoria, laughter, or strange, prophetic dreams. Apothecaries and midwives used these herbs carefully, measuring with the weight of intuition rather than science. They mixed them into ointments, teas, and tonics, often combining several plants together. A patient suffering from sleeplessness might be given a small drink of poppy juice and henbane. Someone racked with grief might be offered a tincture that blended wine with mandrake root. The results were unpredictable. Some found peace. Others fell into fevered trances, seeing shapes in the darkness or hearing music where there was none. To the medieval mind, these experiences were not simply side effects, they were messages. Dreams and visions were part of life's conversation with the divine. A healer might interpret a vision brought on by herbs as a sign from God, or as a warning from darker forces. It was said that the line between healing and witchcraft depended on the outcome. If the patient was cured, it was the grace of God. If they fell ill or saw demons, it was the devil's trickery. These same herbs found their way into rituals and folklore. Witches, according to legend, brewed them into flying ointments, salves that, when rubbed on the skin, gave the sensation of floating or soaring through the air. The truth, as later scholars would understand, was that the ointments contained hallucinogenic alkaloids. The feeling of flight was not real, but the mind believed it. For those who used such mixtures, it was as if they had truly left the earth. These experiences became the source of countless stories, of witches flying to secret gatherings, of women communing with spirits beneath the full moon, of visions that blurred dream and reality. Even outside of witchcraft, people knew that herbs could alter more than the body. Incense burned in churches, sage and rosemary used in sick rooms, or the simple act of brewing a strong tea for calm, all carried echoes of a time when scent and taste were gateways to another state of being. The medieval world was steeped in fragrance and smoke. Healing, worship, and intoxication shared the same air. But this natural intoxication had its dangers. Without modern understanding, overdoses were common. Some who sought relief never woke. Others returned changed, speaking of angels or shadows, of warmth that burned or lights that sang. These stories spread fear and fascination in equal measure. Herbal intoxication was both miracle and menace, a doorway few dared to open twice. Still, curiosity persisted. In every generation, someone would test the limits of nature, seeking visions or comfort that reality could not provide. The fields and forests of medieval Europe were alive with such seekers, healers, mystics, and wanderers who believed that the right leaf, the right prayer, and the right moon could open the mind to something divine. But there was one group that took these experiments further than anyone else, those accused of witchcraft. Their ointments and potions became infamous, their knowledge both feared and desired. In the next chapter, we step into that shadowed world, where herbs, superstition, and imagination met under the moonlight, and the legend of the flying witch was born. In the dim glow of moonlight, when the villages slept and only the wind moved through the trees, stories whispered of figures stirring cauldrons in the woods. The medieval imagination was haunted by witches, women and sometimes men who were said to wield strange powers through potions, charms, and unholy knowledge. To the frightened eyes of their neighbors, these witches were not healers, but conspirators with darkness. Yet behind the fearful tales, there was a very human truth. The so-called witches of the Middle Ages often worked with the same plants, herbs, and brews that healers and apothecaries used. Their crime was not their craft, but the mystery that surrounded it. In a world ruled by faith and fear, knowledge itself was dangerous. Women who knew the ways of herbs, who could ease pain or induce visions, often lived at the edge of society, both respected and distrusted. They mixed herbs to heal, to comfort, to help childbirth or relieve suffering. But their deeper experiments pushed into stranger realms. Some had learned recipes whispered through generations, instructions for ointments and oils that could make one feel as if the body had left the earth. These were the infamous flying salves, a blend of plants like belladonna, henbane, and mandrake, ground together with animal fat and sometimes wine or honey. Applied to the skin, these mixtures absorbed through the body, bringing on intense hallucinations. Those who used such salves described the feeling of rising, of floating through the night air, of traveling to distant places and meeting spirits or other women who shared their art. To the medieval world, this was evidence of witchcraft. To modern eyes, it was the powerful effect of natural chemicals acting on the mind. But to those who experienced it, the difference did not matter. The sensation was real, the dreams vivid. They believed they had flown, and belief itself gave the legend life. These potions were not created for mischief alone. Many who used them sought knowledge, healing, or communion with forces beyond human understanding. The medieval witch, as the legends grew, was often a misunderstood mystic, a figure straddling the line between healer and heretic. She might have been called upon to ease a fever or curse a cruel neighbor, and her tools were the same: herbs, roots, and chants passed down in secrecy. In the flicker of her fire, she represented the power of nature in a world that tried to control it. The Church, however, saw such practices as threats. The use of hallucinogenic herbs was condemned as dabbling with the devil's work. Any altered state that could not be explained by divine inspiration was considered corruption. In sermons and trials, priests spoke of witches who rubbed themselves with ointments and flew to nocturnal gatherings, the Sabbaths of sin, where they danced with demons. The idea of the flying witch became one of the great terrors of the age, feeding centuries of fear. Yet at its root was not demonic power, but chemistry. The henbane and mandrake caused sensations of motion and euphoria. The user's body may have lain still, but their mind traveled far. Still, the association between intoxication and evil took firm hold. To lose control of the mind was to risk losing the soul. The Church taught that visions could come from only two sources: God or the devil. There was no room for the natural power of plants or the curiosity of the human spirit. And so, what began as experiments in herbal medicine and mysticism became grounds for persecution. Women who kept knowledge of herbs were questioned, tortured, and burned. The very same mixtures that once brought healing were now labeled as instruments of heresy. But despite the fear, the fascination endured. People whispered of ointments that could make you fly, of brews that could make you see angels, of powders that could bend desire or memory. These stories spread across Europe, mixing superstition with awe. For every witch burned, a dozen others kept the old knowledge hidden. The plants still grew, the recipes still whispered. The desire to reach beyond the limits of the ordinary mind was too deeply human to be destroyed. And so, beneath the surface of faith and fear, the world continued to dream. The same plants that sent witches soaring also inspired monks, mystics, and visionaries who sought connection with the divine. For while some saw hallucination as heresy, others saw it as holiness. In the next chapter, we enter that sacred tension, where the Church wrestled with the mystery of the mind, and intoxication became not just a danger to the soul, but a temptation that revealed the fragile boundary between heaven and sin. The medieval Church stood as both guardian and judge over the human soul. It claimed authority not only over how people worshipped, but also over how they felt, dreamed, and perceived the world. To the Church, anything that altered the senses was a matter of spiritual concern. The body was the vessel of the soul, and to surrender its control through intoxication was to risk opening the gates of temptation. Yet at the same time, the church itself was steeped in rituals filled with scent, wine, and sound that could lift believers into states of awe and reverence. It was a paradox at the heart of medieval faith, condemning intoxication while practicing it in sacred form. The first and most obvious example of this was wine, the blood of Christ in the Eucharist. In every Mass, priests lifted the chalice and spoke ancient words that turned ordinary wine into a symbol of divine transformation. To drink it was to partake in the mystery of salvation. And yet, wine was also the drink of indulgence and excess. The same liquid that sanctified the altar could, in greater amounts, lead to sin. Monks who brewed and drank it in moderation were praised for discipline. Those who overindulged were punished for gluttony. The message was clear. The tool was not the sin, the loss of control was. Beyond wine, the church made heavy use of incense. Clouds of fragrant smoke rose from swinging censers during ceremonies, filling cathedrals with sweet, hazy air. The faithful were told that the smoke symbolized prayers ascending to heaven, but the effect was also sensory and psychological. Combined with candlelight, chanting, and the vast acoustics of stone walls, the experience could feel transcendent. It stirred emotion, blurred thought, and created a kind of spiritual intoxication that the church embraced. For the devout, this was not the corruption of the senses, but their purification. Still, the church's teachings drew a strict line between holy ecstasy and worldly indulgence. Those who sought altered states outside of sanctioned worship through herbs, potions, or frenzied dances were suspected of consorting with evil. Mystical experiences were carefully examined. If a monk or nun claimed visions, their origins had to be judged. Were they from God or from the devil's deception? Many saints reported states of rapture that today might be described as trance or hallucination. They saw angels, heard voices, and felt lifted beyond the physical world. Some were revered for it, others condemned. The difference often depended on the church's politics more than the visions themselves. Clergy also warned of drunkenness as a gateway to sin. The tavern, with its laughter and disorder, was seen as the devil's playground. To drink to excess was to invite chaos, to speak without restraint, to fight, to lust. Sermons described the drunkard as one who lost the image of God within himself, his reason drowned in ale. Yet in private, many priests and monks enjoyed the same comfort they publicly condemned. Even bishops maintained wine cellars that would have made a nobleman jealous. The contradiction was woven into medieval life: moral restraint preached by day, indulgence practiced by night. The church's opposition to substances was not only moral, but also political. Control over the body meant control over the soul, and control over the soul meant control over society. To experiment with herbs, to seek visions without clerical guidance, was to claim spiritual authority for oneself, a direct challenge to the church's power. Thus, herbalists, mystics, and free thinkers were not just accused of sin, but of rebellion. Their ecstasies were heresies, their trances acts of pride. The inquisitors' flames that would later consume accused witches were as much about fear of independence as about theology. Yet even as the church condemned worldly intoxication, it offered its own version of it: prayer, fasting, flagellation, and endless chanting that led to altered states of consciousness. Some monks described feelings of floating, of glowing light, of hearing divine music. Others felt sudden floods of love or terror, sensations indistinguishable from the effects of drugs or herbs. These experiences were accepted because they were framed within faith. When the mind transcended its limits for God, it was sanctified. When it did so for pleasure, it was sin. In the end, the church's view of intoxication mirrored the medieval world itself: complex, contradictory, and deeply human. People were told to fear the loss of control, yet they longed for transcendence. They were warned against pleasure, yet sought it in secret. The yearning to rise beyond pain and hardship, whether through prayer or potion, was universal. And while priests preached moderation, peasants continued to drink, healers continued to mix herbs, and mystics continued to dream. The church could not silence that longing, only redefine it. In the next chapter, we leave the towering cathedrals and step back into the world of the common folk, the peasants who worked toiled, and found their own humble ways to escape the weight of their lives through the simplest of intoxicants, their home-brewed ales, their laughter, and their stolen moments of freedom. For the peasants of the medieval world, life was a rhythm of labor, hunger, and endurance. The dawn began with the sound of the rooster, and the day ended with aching limbs and sore backs. Fields stretched endlessly, seasons dictated survival, and comfort was a luxury reserved for the few. Yet even among the hardships, the common people found ways to escape, moments of lightness that lifted them above the grind of existence. Their intoxication did not come from imported opiates or rare elixirs, but from the simple earthly pleasures of drink, song, and fellowship. The peasant's ale was their constant companion. It was made at home or in small village breweries, using barley, oats, and sometimes whatever grains could be spared. It was cloudy, thick, and nourishing, more food than drink. Children, elders, and laborers all drank it daily. The weak ale quenched thirst, and the stronger brews brought laughter. For a people who lived under constant toil, that light, buzzing warmth was a blessing. In the glow of a hearth or the smoky haze of a tavern, the worries of the day faded, replaced by stories, jokes, and songs that echoed through the night. The village alehouse was more than a place to drink. It was the center of community life. It was here that news was shared, marriages arranged, and disputes settled. It was the one place where a peasant could speak freely, at least for a while. The ale loosened tongues and softened tempers, and though brawls were common, so too were friendships forged in drink. A tankard of strong brew might lead to a song about love or loss, a joke at the Lord's expense, or a whispered confession of dreams ever spoken aloud. These were moments of freedom, tiny rebellions against the heavy silence of work and duty. But ale was not the only escape. Some peasants grew herbs in secret gardens, not just for medicine, but for comfort. Small doses of poppy or henbane mixed into a tea or chew could quiet pain and soften the edges of hunger. Such practices were often hidden, passed quietly among families. A grandmother might keep a small pouch of dried leaves in her apron, given only to those she trusted. These were not drugs for pleasure, but for survival, a way to dull the ache of cold winters and the grief of too many funerals. Festivals offered a brighter kind of release. Holy days and harvest celebrations broke the monotony of labor with music, food, and drink that flowed freely. For a few days each year, the strict rules of class and propriety loosened. Villagers danced, laughed, and forgot their masters. Even the church, which frowned on drunkenness, tolerated such outbursts, knowing they kept the people content the rest of the year. Bonfires blazed, horns were raised, and the night became a blur of warmth and wildness. Some of these gatherings carried traces of older, pagan rituals, echoes of ancient fertility rites, and harvest feasts where intoxication was seen not as sin, but as communion with nature's joy. The laughter of those nights was a kind of resistance. For the peasant, intoxication was not decadence, it was survival. To feel light after a day of burden, to share a laugh after endless silence, was a way to remember humanity. The village drunkard might be mocked, but in truth, his overindulgence was only an exaggeration of what everyone sought, a brief escape from a life that offered so few comforts. Even so, the dangers were real. The poor often brewed ale too strong, or used unsafe herbs. Accidents happened. Fights broke out. Some drank until their minds slipped away. But the risk was accepted, because for many, It was the only relief they knew. Poverty and pain demanded release, and if the price was a pounding head the next morning, it was one they willingly paid. Not all forms of escape were physical. Some peasants turned to faith in ways that bordered on the ecstatic. Long nights of prayer, fasting, or chanting sometimes led to visions, moments of transcendence that offered a spiritual high unlike any drink. Whether through ale or devotion, the goal was the same: to step beyond the walls of reality, even for a heartbeat. The lives of peasants were shaped by endurance, but also by resilience. Their escapes, small, fleeting, and often unrecorded, remind us that joy existed even in struggle. Beneath the shadow of castles and cathedrals, they found ways to feel alive. The world might have been harsh, but within the laughter of a crowded tavern or the warmth of shared drink, the burdens of life grew lighter. Yet while the peasants sought escape through simple pleasures, another group, the learned doctors and apothecaries of medieval cities, approached intoxication from a different angle. To them, these substances were not only for relief or pleasure, but instruments of knowledge, experiment, and control. In the next chapter, we enter their world, where medicine met mystery, and healing often drifted dangerously close to getting high. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a strange and delicate balance of faith, superstition, and experiment. Doctors and healers saw the body not as a machine of flesh and blood, but as a system of humors, fluids that governed health, mood, and spirit. These humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, had to remain in harmony, or illness would take hold. To treat imbalance, physicians turned to the natural world, mixing potions, powders, and elixirs from plants, minerals, and animal parts. Some of these mixtures healed, some harmed, and some did something more mysterious. They changed perception. They made patients dream, drift, or detach from pain. In short, they altered the mind. The medieval physician was as much alchemist as scientist. The study of medicine was steeped in philosophy, astrology, and mysticism. Students learned from ancient texts by Galen and Avicenna, often copied in monasteries or brought from the Islamic world. The recipes they memorized were centuries old, but still alive with power. A sleeping potion might call for crushed poppy seeds, henbane, and mandrake. A cure for melancholy might include opium, wine, and a pinch of saffron. These ingredients were not measured by weight or purity, but by intuition, and the effects could vary wildly from patient to patient. Apothecaries were the heart of this practice. Their shops were filled with the scents of earth and spice, jars of dried leaves, bundles of roots, powders of every color. They served the wealthy and the poor alike, offering both medicine and mystery. To the untrained eye, their work seemed like magic. They mixed opium with honey, added crushed herbs to wine, and boiled resins into sticky tonics that promised everything from better sleep to eternal youth. For many who sought their help, the relief was real. For others, the results were something else entirely: visions, euphoria, or long, dreamlike states that blurred the line between life and death. Anesthetic potions, though rare and risky, were among the most valuable creations. Surgery in the medieval world was brutal, and any way to dull pain was a treasure. Healers experimented with mixtures of mandrake, poppy, and hemlock to create what they called the sleeping sponges. These were cloths soaked in the deadly brew, dried, and then pressed to the patient's nose or lips to induce unconsciousness. When they worked, it was considered a miracle. When they didn't, the patient might never wake again. The boundary between healing and harm was perilously thin. Medicine was also deeply tied to faith. Doctors prayed before treating patients. Monks brewed remedies in cloisters, believing that every cure was a reflection of divine wisdom. But outside the safety of holy walls, suspicion grew. The use of powerful herbs and narcotics raised questions. Was the healer guided by God or by darker influences? The same plants used to dull pain were used by so-called witches to create trances. The same ingredients that eased fever could bring hallucinations. The church tolerated medicine as long as it served health, but when it touched the mind, it entered dangerous territory. Still, experimentation continued. Physicians studied the effects of substances on the body with quiet fascination. They recorded how much poppy would calm a patient, how much would make him delirious. They noted how certain herbs brought dreams of fire or light. And though they framed their work in pious language, many were driven by genuine curiosity, a desire to understand how the soul and the body intertwined. They believed that through studying nature, they might glimpse the secrets of creation itself. One of the most common medicines was theriac, a complex compound said to cure any poison. Its recipe contained more than 60 ingredients, including opium, cinnamon, myrrh, and viper flesh. It was boiled and aged for years, turning thick and potent. Nobles paid fortunes for it, keeping small jars as both medicine and luxury. It dulled pain, brought calm, and in larger doses, carried the mind into strange serenity. To take theriac was to step softly into another realm, guided by the confidence that it was a holy cure rather than a sinful pleasure. The people of the Middle Ages did not think of these experiences as getting high. They believed that substances acted on the soul as much as the body. When a potion brought peace, it was divine mercy. When it caused madness, it was a lesson or a test. The distinction between medicine and mysticism depended on outcome, not intention. In this blend of science and spirituality, the medieval physician was both healer and priest, a keeper of balance in a world where health and holiness were one. His potions promised relief from pain, but they also opened windows to places few dared to look. The patients who drifted away under the influence of herbs might have believed they saw heaven or the edge of it. And while doctors and monks continued their experiments in quiet rooms filled with smoke and candlelight, another kind of intoxication filled the air in cathedrals and temples, not from drink or potion, but from the scented haze of incense. It was a different kind of high, one sanctioned by the church, and it carried millions of souls upward in silent awe. In the next chapter, we breathe that fragrant air and explore the intoxicating world of sacred smoke. Step into a medieval cathedral, and the air itself becomes part of the experience. Light filters through colored glass, painting the stone walls with patterns of crimson and gold. The low hum of chant fills the vast space, echoing endlessly, as if the very building were breathing. And through it all drifts the heavy scent of incense, sweet, resinous, and thick. It clings to robes, curls through the air, and settles into every breath. To the medieval worshipper, this scent was not decoration. It was divine presence made visible, a bridge between earth and heaven. But in truth, it was also a kind of intoxication. Incense had been used for thousands of years before the Middle Ages, in temples and rituals across the ancient world. The church inherited this tradition and transformed it into a symbol of prayer. When a priest swung the censer, the smoke rose in graceful trails, carrying the faithful's hopes upward toward God. Yet behind the symbolism, there was chemistry. The burning of frankincense, myrrh, and other resins released compounds that could soothe the body and calm the mind. Combined with chanting, dim light, and rhythmic ceremony, it created an atmosphere that could easily lead to altered states of consciousness. For peasants and nobles alike, entering a cathedral filled with incense was unlike any other experience in their lives. The scent was exotic, far removed from the smells of mud, sweat, and smoke that filled their days. It came from distant lands, Arabia, India, and Africa, and its rarity gave it power. To inhale, it was to touch something holy. Some chroniclers even noted how people fainted or wept during long ceremonies, overcome by the combination of scent, song, and light. Today we might call that sensory overload or euphoria, but in the medieval world, it was a moment of grace. The monks and clergy who prepared incense mixtures treated the process as sacred work. They ground the resin slowly, mixed them with oils, and blessed the materials before burning. The recipes varied from place to place. Some added herbs like sage, rosemary, or lavender. Others used rare spices such as cinnamon or clove. The result was always intoxicating, a cloud that blurred the line between spiritual devotion and physical pleasure. The mind softened, thoughts grew distant, and the world beyond the church doors seemed to fade away. To the church, this effect was not indulgence but revelation. The body was overwhelmed so the soul could rise. Every sense was engaged: the sight of light, the sound of hymns, the scent of smoke, drawing the faithful closer to divine mystery. Yet, in that very experience, one can sense the same human desire that drove the use of herbs and potions outside the church, the longing to transcend the ordinary, to feel lifted beyond oneself. The church condemned intoxication that came from drink or drugs, but sanctified the same sensations when wrapped in ritual and faith. Outside the cathedrals, incense had other uses too. Apothecaries sold small lumps of resin to burn in homes, both for their pleasant aroma and supposed power to ward off disease. During outbreaks of plague, people walked through streets with herbs and incense pressed to their faces, believing the smoke could purify the air. In monasteries, incense was used to calm restless minds during prayer, or to mask the odor of illness and decay in infirmaries. Even in death, it surrounded the body, burned at funerals to honor the departed and comfort the living. But the power of scent went beyond the sacred and the sick. It could seduce, comfort, or disorient. Perfumed oils and incenses were traded like treasure, symbols of status and refinement. Nobles filled their chambers with them, seeking both luxury and escape. The rich, like the poor, were not immune to the quiet intoxication of aroma. The difference was only in presentation. One called it sin, the other sanctity. In every corner of medieval life, from the lowest chapel to the grandest cathedral, incense shaped the experience of the divine. It was proof that the spirit could be touched through the senses, that the invisible could be made tangible. For a few moments, as the smoke curled toward the vaulted ceilings, time seemed to pause. The body breathed deeply, the mind stilled, and the heart opened. That was the essence of medieval intoxication, not rebellion, but surrender. Yet not all who sought that kind of surrender did so in quiet reverence. Beyond the church doors, in the open fields and village squares, festivals brought another kind of ecstasy, one loud, chaotic, and wildly human. In the next chapter, we leave the solemn calm of incense and step into the roar of medieval celebration, where drunkenness was not sin but spectacle, and intoxication became the heartbeat of joy. If the cathedral was the place where souls rose in quiet reverence, the village festival was where they soared in laughter, song, and chaos. Medieval life was a cycle of labor and obedience, but scattered through the year were days when everything turned upside down, days of sanctioned wildness, where the poor could act rich, the meek could shout, and the sober could drink until the world itself seemed to spin. These were the festivals, the carnivals, and the feasts of drunkenness, moments when all the rigid order of medieval society briefly dissolved into joy. For peasants, these celebrations were both escape and necessity. The church calendar offered many feast days, marking saints, harvests, and holy events. On those days, work paused. Alehouses overflowed, bonfires burned, and music filled the air. People danced in the streets, wore masks, and shared drink until their voices gave out. Even priests sometimes joined the festivities, though officially they disapproved. The church tolerated the excess because it served a purpose. It released pressure. After months of hardship, the people needed a break from the endless toil, a chance to forget their hunger and servitude. Drunkenness became a ritual of renewal. At the heart of these feasts was the drink, ale, mead, or wine, flowing freely in wooden mugs and clay jugs. There were no rules about moderation. In fact, drunkenness was expected. A man who remained sober might be teased or even pitied. To drink deeply was to show gratitude for life and faith in the next harvest. The songs grew louder as the night wore on. Ballads of love, of lost battles, of foolish kings and clever peasants. The line between celebration and chaos was always thin, and many nights ended with fights, laughter, or tears. But even when tempers flared, there was a strange unity in it. For one night, the villagers were equals, all bound by the haze of drink and shared release. One of the most famous of these events was the Feast of Fools. During this festival, the roles of power were inverted. Choir boys dressed as bishops, peasants mocked priests, and laughter echoed through church halls. The intoxication was not just physical, but social. The thrill of freedom, the joy of rebellion without consequence. The church tolerated it grudgingly, knowing that a few days of madness helped maintain order for the rest of the year. The world was briefly turned on its head so that it could return, afterward, to its usual place. Other celebrations were tied to the turning of the seasons: midsummer, May Day, and harvest festivals where fertility and abundance were honored. Fires were lit on hilltops, and villagers danced around them, sometimes until dawn. Mead was poured as an offering to the spirits of the earth, and couples slipped away into the dark fields, following ancient customs older than Christianity itself. In those nights of warmth and intoxication, people touched something deeper than drunken joy, a sense of connection to nature, to the cycle of life, and to each other. For the wealthy, festivals were no less intoxicating, though far more extravagant. In castle halls, banquets stretched for hours, with endless courses of roasted meats, sweet wines, and spiced desserts. Minstrels played, jesters performed, and noblemen boasted of their prowess in war or love. By midnight, dignity dissolved. Even the proudest lord might be found laughing too loudly, his golden cup spilling wine onto the rush-covered floor. Intoxication blurred the lines between master and servant, priest and sinner. For one fleeting night, all were human, vulnerable, and alive. But beneath the laughter and the wine, there was always an undertone of danger. Festivals often ended in accidents or violence. Fires grew too large, brawls erupted, and drunken wanderers lost their way home. Chroniclers wrote of towns descending into disorder, of sins confessed in the morning light. Yet despite these warnings, the festivals continued year after year. People needed them. They were reminders that life, though hard, could still hold beauty. To the medieval mind, joy and sin were intertwined. Pleasure was dangerous, but irresistible. Drunkenness was condemned from the pulpit and celebrated in the streets. It was humanity laid bare, flawed, foolish, but full of life. And in a world shadowed by hunger, war, and plague, that kind of joy was a form of survival. The festivals of drunkenness were not just diversions. They were the pulse of the medieval world. In their firelight and song, people found freedom from fear. They laughed at death, defied authority, and touched, if only for a few hours, a kind of happiness that no sermon could give. But while the common folk reveled openly, another kind of intoxication brewed in private, one reserved for the privileged, hidden behind stone walls and silken curtains. In the next chapter, we will slip quietly into that secret world of the elite, where imported spices, strange powders, and forbidden pleasures awaited the nobles who could afford to chase their own version of the medieval high. Behind the castle gates, far from the muddy fields and rowdy taverns, the noble classes of the Middle Ages lived in a world wrapped in silk and secrecy. Their intoxication was quieter, rarer, and far more expensive than that of the peasants. While the poor filled their mugs with ale and laughter, the wealthy sipped imported wines, tasted exotic spices, and experimented with mysterious substances carried across continents. For the privileged few, intoxication was not a sin but a luxury, a mark of refinement, power, and curiosity. The nobility had access to the treasures of trade routes that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Far East. Through merchants, crusaders, and scholars, Europe discovered strange powders, fragrant resins, and rare plants that promised pleasure, relief, or inspiration. Among these were opium, nutmeg, cloves, and exotic incense, each arriving in small quantities worth their weight in gold. Apothecaries serving the upper classes crafted potions and tonics that combined these ingredients, often under the guise of medicine. A noblewoman might take a draught to calm her nerves. A knight might sip a mixture before sleep to quiet the echoes of battle. The effects were real, soft waves of calm, euphoria, and vivid dreams that lingered long after waking. Wines were the most visible indulgence of the elite. Imported from France, Italy, and Spain, they came in varieties unknown to the common folk. Nobles drank sweet wines flavored with honey, herbs, and spices, clove, cinnamon, and even rosewater. They believed these blends to be both luxurious and medicinal. A good vintage could make the mind sharper, the body warmer, and conversation flow with ease. Feasts were often exercises in excess, where goblets overflowed and restraint vanished. Yet even amid laughter and song, the noble intoxication carried an air of control. To drink well was to show sophistication. To lose composure was to show weakness. Beyond drink, the upper classes also dabbled in narcotics brought from the East. Small vials of powdered opium appeared in the apothecaries of major cities, traded through Venetian merchants who claimed it as a cure for sleeplessness and melancholy. It was mixed with wine or dissolved in syrup, turning into something sweet and strangely soothing. Some nobles began to use it not only for ailments but for escape. After long banquets, when the hall had quieted and the torches burned low, they would retire to their private chambers and sip the dark mixture in silence, letting their thoughts drift into a haze of comfort and detachment. Perfumes and incense, too, played their part in noble intoxication. Rooms were filled with the smoke of frankincense, amber, and musk. Aromatic oils from Damascus and Alexandria perfumed the air, the skin, and even the wine. These scents were symbols of wealth, but they were also mild narcotics, calming the nerves and dulling the senses. In dimly lit rooms, among silks and shadows, the combination of fragrance, candlelight, and wine created an atmosphere that blurred reality. It was a kind of waking dream, half prayer, half pleasure. Some nobles took their experiments further, especially those with scholarly or mystical leanings. The medieval courts of Italy, France, and the Holy Roman Empire were home to alchemists who sought not just gold but enlightenment. These alchemists mixed substances that smoked, shimmered, and sometimes exploded. They believed that within the transformation of matter lay the secret to spiritual transformation as well. For their patrons, the experiments were thrilling, part science, part spectacle. Some of these mixtures contained chemicals that produced lightheadedness or strange sensations, perhaps without the alchemist even realizing why. Yet not all indulgences ended in delight. Overuse of imported narcotics or strong wines led to sickness, addiction, and decline. Some noble families developed reputations for melancholy, what later ages might call depression, brought on by excess. The very substances that once soothed them began to steal their vitality. Chroniclers occasionally described lords who slept too long, spoke in dreams, or withdrew into solitude. Servants whispered of strange bottles hidden behind curtains, of lords who gazed at nothing for hours while their castles grew quiet. Despite the risks, the pursuit of pleasure and transcendence never stopped. For the nobility, intoxication was another form of mastery. Mastery over the body, over boredom, over mortality itself. In a world obsessed with control, losing oneself, even briefly, was both terrifying and irresistible. What the nobles found in their potions, the mystics sought through prayer. Both chased visions. Both sought meaning beyond the tangible world. And sometimes, Those visions came unbidden, through ecstasy, fasting, or the quiet touch of madness. In the next chapter, we'll step into that sacred uncertainty, where hallucination and holiness intertwined, and where the line between divine revelation and delirium all but disappeared. In the dim monasteries and silent cloisters of medieval Europe, visions were as real as stone walls. Saints spoke of radiant light, angels, and voices that whispered truths from beyond. Mystics described soaring through the heavens or falling into the arms of divine love. To those who believed, these experiences were miracles, proof of faith so strong it could pierce the veil between heaven and earth. But to others, even in that deeply spiritual age, such visions raised uneasy questions. Were these moments of divine revelation? Or were they simply the result of hunger, exhaustion, or substances that shifted the mind's fragile balance? The line between holiness and hallucination was impossibly thin. Many of the most revered figures in medieval spirituality, Saint Hildegard of Bingen, Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint Catherine of Siena, experienced vivid sensory visions. They saw glowing figures, heard heavenly music, and felt physical sensations that defied explanation. Hildegard, in particular, described blinding lights and shapes that danced before her eyes, visions she later transformed into art and music. Modern scholars have speculated that her experiences might have been caused by migraines or fasting, but to her contemporaries, they were divine gifts. Her altered states were celebrated, not questioned. But not all who saw visions were canonized. For every saintly mystic, there were dozens of others, men and women who claimed divine inspiration but were dismissed as deluded, dangerous, or possessed. The medieval church walked a fine line. It needed miracles to reaffirm faith, yet feared anything that smelled of heresy. A vision could make someone a saint or a sinner, depending on how it fit the church as narrative. A holy woman who spoke of love and obedience might be embraced. One who claimed to speak new truths beyond Scripture risked being silenced. Fasting was one of the most common paths to spiritual ecstasy. Monks and nuns deprived themselves of food and sleep to purify their souls. Over time, this deprivation altered their perception. Colors grew brighter, sounds sharper, and dreams more vivid. Many believed these sensations were signs of closeness to God. In reality, the body's exhaustion and hunger could easily induce trance-like states and hallucinations. But for the medieval believer, the physical suffering only made the experience more sacred. Pain was prayer made visible, and visions were its reward. Some mystics enhanced their spiritual practices with herbs and incenses, believing these substances could open the heart to divine presence. Monastic gardens grew not only food and medicine, but also plants known to calm or elevate the mind. The fragrant smoke of burning herbs during long vigils could blur reality, turning flickering candlelight into visions of heavenly fire. These were not deliberate acts of intoxication, at least not consciously. They were acts of devotion, but devotion that often led the mind to places beyond rational control. The Church's scholars debated how to tell a holy vision from a sinful delusion. St. Augustine warned that even the devil could appear as an angel of light, tricking the faithful into pride. Thomas Aquinas wrote that true visions brought humility, while false ones led to vanity. Yet these distinctions were subjective and often political. A vision that supported the Church's authority was holy. One that questioned it was heresy. Mystics who claimed direct communication with God without priestly mediation, especially women, were particularly dangerous in the Church as eyes. Many were investigated, confined, or executed. Still, the hunger for the divine could not be contained. Across Europe, ordinary people began reporting visions and raptures. Pilgrims collapsed in tears at relics, villagers claimed to see saints in the sky, and entire communities were swept up in fits of religious ecstasy. Some of these were genuine faith, some psychological contagion, and some perhaps fueled by substances in their food or drink. In certain regions, rye infected with ergot fungus, a natural hallucinogen, may have caused mass visions. Those who consumed it described burning sensations, convulsions, and dazzling hallucinations. The afflicted often turned to the church for explanation, and what they received depended on interpretation: divine sign, mass hysteria, or witchcraft. For those who experienced it, the distinction didn't matter. In their altered states, they felt touched by something greater: love, terror, or awe, so overwhelming it defied words. Whether holy or chemical, the experience itself was truth. And perhaps that is why the medieval world was both fascinated and terrified by visions. They revealed how fragile reality could be, how easily the mind could cross from the earthly to the eternal. To live in the Middle Ages was to live close to mystery. Every sickness, every dream, every flash of light in the corner of one's vision could be a message from heaven or a trick of the senses. For the mystic, it was a gift. For the skeptic, a warning. And for the countless souls in between, it was a reminder that to seek the divine was to risk losing oneself in the process. But while some visions uplifted, others destroyed. For every holy ecstasy, there were darker experiments, deadly potions, poisonous brews, and reckless indulgence that ended in tragedy. In the next chapter, we turn to the other side of intoxication, where curiosity crossed into danger, and the quest for transcendence became the cause of death. In every age, the pursuit of altered states has walked hand in hand with danger, and the Middle Ages were no exception. For every monk who sought holy ecstasy and every healer who brewed for comfort, there were others who took one sip too many, one breath too deep, one dose too strong. The medieval world was filled with potent substances, most of them only partially understood. Medicine and poison were often twins, separated by nothing more than the trembling hand of the apothecary or the blind hope of the patient. And when the balance tipped, the results could be deadly. Poisons were everywhere in medieval life. Some were used in warfare, others in politics, and some in quiet corners of villages where despair or vengeance brewed in secret. But even among ordinary people, death could come from a simple misunderstanding. A healer mixing herbs by candlelight, a cook mistaking a deadly leaf for a harmless one. Belladonna, known as deadly nightshade, was a frequent culprit. Just a few berries could cause visions, delirium, and finally stillness. Yet in small doses, it was used to treat pain and swelling. Mandrake root, shaped like a tiny human, was said to hold both healing and danger within its grasp. Too little, and it did nothing. Too much, and it could still the heart. Even alcohol could turn fatal. Home-brewed ale often contained impurities or herbs added without measure. Strong spirits were rare, but mead and wine could easily ferment too far, creating brews that left drinkers sick or unconscious. In an age without clean water, people drank constantly, unaware that dehydration and disease could amplify the effects. There were stories of peasants who fell asleep by the hearth after a long night of drinking and never woke. Chroniclers often described these deaths as divine punishment, though in truth, they were the simple result of chemistry gone awry. The most feared of all potions were those used for sleep and surgery, mixtures of poppy, hemlock, and mandrake designed to render a person insensible. When successful, they dulled pain and saved lives. When mismeasured, they silenced the patient forever. Even the best trained physicians admitted their uncertainty. In their writings, they pleaded for God's mercy before using such potions, knowing that every drop was a gamble between healing and death. Then there were the love potions and charms, passed quietly between lovers or sold in the shadows of marketplaces. They promised passion, loyalty, or forgetfulness, and they were often brewed from dangerous ingredients. A drop of belladonna to ignite desire, a pinch of fly agaric mushroom to open the senses, or a sip of opium syrup to calm the nerves. These mixtures sometimes worked, just not as intended. The victim of a love potion might swoon into unconsciousness or slip into fevered dreams. Some never recovered. Yet the trade continued, because longing, like curiosity, was stronger than fear. A fascination with poison extended into the courts of the powerful. Assassination through subtle means became an art. Italian chronicles tell of nobles who carried rings with hidden compartments filled with powdered toxins. In France and England, whispered rumors accused queens and bishops of using potions to weaken rivals or control lovers. Whether true or not, the fear of poisoning grew so great that many rulers kept official tasters, and meals were prepared only under guard. Yet even the wealthy were not immune to accident. Imported drugs and exotic elixirs often contained lethal impurities. What was meant to heal the mind could easily unmake it. The Church viewed all this with a mixture of horror and fascination. To tamper with the body's balance was to trespass on divine design. Yet priests themselves prescribed herbal remedies and blessed medicines. When deaths occurred, blame was easily cast toward witches or demons, preserving the illusion of human innocence. In truth, the danger came not from magic, but from ignorance, a world still learning the language of the substances it wielded. There were moments when death by intoxication took on almost mythic form. Some chroniclers wrote of knights who drank strange potions before battle to dull fear, only to fall lifeless before the enemy reached them. Others spoke of monks who fasted and drank bitter herbs to see visions, and never returned from their trances. In an age where every mystery was touched by faith, even a fatal overdose could become a parable, a warning against pride, against reaching too far toward the divine. The deadly highs of the Middle Ages remind us that the desire to escape pain and touch the extraordinary has always carried risk. Whether through drink, drug, or devotion, the human mind has forever sought to transcend itself, even when that path led to ruin. These stories are echoes of that ancient yearning, proof that the price of wonder has always been paid in flesh. But death was not the only punishment awaiting those who strayed too far. In many places, the law itself was merciless toward those who lost control, whether through drunkenness or the use of forbidden substances. In the next chapter, we step into the courts and streets of medieval justice, where intoxication could turn a sinner into a criminal, and a night of indulgence could end in chains. In a world where faith and fear guided the rules of life, the law had much to say about those who gave in to drink or strange substances. The medieval mind believed that sin and crime were often the same thing, that the loss of control over the body and tongue could open the door to chaos. A drunk man was not merely foolish. He was dangerous to himself, to others, and to the fragile order that held the community together. So, while drunkenness was common, it was also one of the most frequently condemned acts in both sermons and statutes. In the towns and villages of medieval Europe, there were few written laws about drinking at first. The alehouse was central to social life, and most people drank daily. But as the centuries passed, the behavior that came with intoxication drew the attention of local lords and church courts. Fights, thefts, and insults often began in taverns. Public drunkenness led to disorder, and disorder was a threat to authority. So rules were made. Tavern owners were fined for serving a man who had clearly had too much. Drunkards caught disturbing the peace were placed in the stocks, wooden frames that locked their heads and hands in place, leaving them to the jeers of their neighbors. In some places, they were forced to wear shameful signs or barrels labeled with mocking words like ale-sot or drunken fool. The church's judgment was harsher still. Sermons painted the drunkard as a soul enslaved by gluttony, one of the 7 deadly sins. Priests warned that to lose control of one's senses was to invite demons into the mind. Confessors required penance, fasting, prayer, or even public humiliation for those who admitted to repeated drunkenness. In some cases, a man who caused harm while drunk was told his sin was doubled, for he had surrendered not only reason but morality. Yet despite the harsh words from the pulpit, The very priests who condemned the behavior often drank wine themselves, a contradiction not lost on their congregations. The punishments for intoxication varied by class. A poor farmer who stumbled home singing might face ridicule or a night in the stocks. A nobleman who drank too deeply could often excuse his behavior as passion or sorrow. The law, like the world, bent around wealth and power. Still, even among the highborn, chronic drunkenness was frowned upon. A noble who could not govern himself was seen as unfit to govern others. Chroniclers recorded tales of fallen knights and ruined lords, their fortunes and honor dissolved in wine. There were also laws about taverns themselves, when they could open, what they could serve, and who could enter. In some towns, they were required to close at sunset to prevent nocturnal mischief. Prices were regulated to stop tavern keepers from watering down ale or cheating customers. Taverns became places of both freedom and surveillance, hubs of gossip and joy, but also of watchful eyes. Officials visited unannounced, checking for gambling, brawls, or illicit gatherings. To drink too much in such a place was to risk more than a hangover. It was to risk becoming a public example. Yet, even as the law punished the drunkard, it depended on the alehouse. Taxes on beer and wine filled the coffers of lords and kings. Many rulers owned breweries or took a share of the profits. Soldiers received beer rations as part of their pay, and monasteries thrived on the sale of their fine brews. It was a contradiction woven into the fabric of medieval society, to condemn what one could not do without. The authorities needed order, but they also needed revenue. And so, drunkenness was punished not to eliminate it, but to control it. Other intoxicants, such as opium or hallucinogenic herbs, were rarer and thus harder to police. When trouble arose from them, the blame usually fell on witchcraft or heresy. A person who claimed visions after drinking a strange potion might be questioned by priests or imprisoned by local authorities. The law could not distinguish between spiritual ecstasy and madness. Both were treated as potential threats. To be out of one's senses was to step outside the boundaries of what society could tolerate. Still, beneath all the laws and punishments, the truth endured. People drank, smoked, and dreamed because life was hard and the world was uncertain. The law could lock a man in the stocks, but it could not remove the thirst that lived in his soul. Even the magistrates who passed judgment on drunkards sometimes ended their nights with wine. The medieval law against intoxication was less about morality than about control. It sought to remind people who held power and who did not. But for those living under its rule, the desire for escape was unstoppable. They accepted the risk of punishment for the joy, the warmth, or the forgetfulness that intoxication offered was worth it. In the next chapter, we turn from punishment to creation, from the laws that tried to suppress indulgence to the artists and poets who embraced it. For in the flickering candlelight of the Middle Ages, some of the most inspired works of art and verse were born from the haze of intoxication and the trembling edge between madness and genius. The Middle Ages are often remembered for their wars, their faith, and their darkness, but hidden beneath that shadow was a pulse of creativity that never stopped beating. Poets sang of longing, monks illuminated manuscripts with glowing color, and musicians filled stone chapels with sound that shimmered like water. Art was everywhere, and behind much of it lay the same yearning that drove people to drink, dream, or pray, the desire to step beyond the ordinary. In that sense, artists and poets were the alchemists of the soul, transforming their own forms of intoxication into beauty that still endures. The medieval artist's world was one of extremes, deep faith, and deep emotion, often intertwined. Many poets and painters saw their work as divine inspiration, a gift that came from God through the imagination. But others admitted that their greatest moments of creativity arrived after long nights of wine or after days of sleepless obsession. The link between inspiration and madness was well known. Even the scholars of the time believed that strong feeling could open the mind to heavenly insight or to dangerous delusion. To create was to walk a narrow line between revelation and ruin. The taverns of medieval towns were not only places for laughter, but also for verse. Wandering poets known as troubadours in the south of France and minnesingers in Germany performed songs of love, sorrow, and satire. They sang of heartbreak and wine, often blurring the two into one intoxicating metaphor. Their verses spoke of nights spent drunk on desire or drink, of visions seen in candlelight, of madness mistaken for devotion. Wine was both muse and mirror, a way to see the world not as it was, but as it could be. These poets were often outsiders, beloved by the people but scorned by the powerful. Their words cut through pretense, showing how easily intoxication revealed truth. In monasteries, artistic intoxication took a quieter form. Illuminators spent long hours hunched over parchment, coloring sacred texts with gold and pigment ground from lapis lazuli, crushed insects, and ash. The work required endless patience, but many monks described moments of transcendence, times when they forgot their bodies and felt only the rhythm of creation. Some likened it to prayer, others to trance. The repetition of chant, the smell of ink, the flicker of candlelight all worked together to lull the senses into stillness, a different kind of high born from devotion and silence. There were also those who turned their intoxication inward. Mystical poets and writers like Mechteld of Magdeburg or Hadwijs of Brabant wrote of their ecstatic union with the divine in language that bordered on erotic. Their words overflowed with passion, as if they were drunk on God himself. They spoke of burning, of sweetness, of surrender. To the church, such writing was both dangerous and beautiful, proof that the divine could inspire, but also a reminder that desire, even spiritual, was perilous ground. These women lived on the edge of acceptability, their visions celebrated by some and feared by others. Madness, too, was part of this world. In an age without psychology, those who saw visions or spoke in riddles were seen as touched by God, by spirits, or by imbalance of the humors. Some were revered, others imprisoned. Artists and poets often walked that same edge. Their obsessions drove them beyond the limits of sleep and hunger. They poured their entire being into their craft until they were left trembling, hollow, and yet fulfilled. To lose oneself in art was, in many ways, the same as losing oneself to wine or prayer. It was an intoxication of the spirit, less visible, but no less consuming. Even the great writers of the later medieval world understood this connection. Geoffrey Chaucer, in his Canterbury Tales, filled his stories with characters who drank, sang, and confessed their foolishness with laughter. He understood that humanity's flaws were inseparable from its creativity. The same impulses that led one person to excess could lead another to poetry. The drunkard, the dreamer, and the artist all reached for the same thing, a moment of escape from the weight of reality. The idea that madness and genius were intertwined was not a modern invention. Medieval thinkers often spoke of divine frenzy, the notion that inspiration came when reason was suspended. Plato's words on sacred madness were known even then, copied and debated by scholars. To create something extraordinary, one had to risk losing control, to surrender logic to emotion, structure to instinct. The poet who drank to loosen his tongue, the painter who worked through the night until his hands shook, the mystic who saw visions in her solitude, all were seekers of the same intoxication. But creativity had its price. Many artists lived poor, forgotten, or misunderstood. The church valued beauty, but distrusted those who seemed too free. A painting that stirred too much emotion, or a song that sounded too wild, could be called blasphemy. The artist's high, like the drunkard's, was tolerated only in moderation. Beyond that, it became dangerous, a reminder that beauty itself could be intoxicating, that the human soul was always hungry for something more. In their poetry, their songs, and their art, the dreamers of the Middle Ages captured what no potion or brew could fully deliver: a lasting glimpse of transcendence. Their work was the echo of that ancient desire to rise above the ordinary, to feel infinite, if only for a moment. Yet as the centuries turned, the world began to change. Science and trade brought new knowledge, new substances, and new fears. The mystical highs of the old world began to fade, replaced by curiosity and caution. In the next chapter, we'll watch the slow decline of the medieval high, how discovery and reason began to tame the mysteries that once set hearts and minds ablaze. By the end of the Middle Ages, the world was changing. The rhythms that had defined life for centuries, prayer, superstition, and the slow pulse of nature, began to quicken. Trade expanded, science flickered to life, and the great map of the known world grew wider. With it came a shift in how people thought about the body, the soul, and the strange, intoxicating substances that bridged them. The mystical highs that once shaped medieval life, the potions, the visions, the sacred ecstasies, began to lose their place. Slowly, the world's intoxication became less about mystery and more about measurement. The Renaissance dawned with curiosity. Scholars rediscovered the works of the ancients, studying them not as divine relics, but as guides to reason. Physicians began to challenge the old humoral theories, experimenting with new methods of observation and record. Alchemy transformed into the early language of chemistry. The healer's hut and the apothecary's shop gave way to the laboratory. Substances once seen as magical were dissected, classified, and analyzed. Opium, once treated as a sacred gift from the East, was now a subject of study. Mandrake and belladonna, feared and revered for centuries, were measured in controlled doses. The mystery that once surrounded them began to fade beneath the light of inquiry. This was not a sudden change, but a gradual turning of the world's mind. The Church, which had once ruled the understanding of both sin and medicine, began to lose its absolute hold. Science crept in, whispering explanations for visions that were once thought divine. Hallucinations became symptoms. Madness became illness. Ecstasy was no longer proof of holiness, but something to be treated, observed, and, if possible, cured. What was once a miracle became a matter of the mind. The boundary between heaven and human thought began to narrow, and with it, the old ways of seeking transcendence began to disappear. Yet the hunger for escape did not vanish. It merely changed shape. The tavern remained full, and the ale still flowed, but its meaning shifted. No longer tied to ritual or myth, drink became a pastime, a pleasure rather than a sacrament. The festivals lost some of their wildness as new rules of civility took hold. The peasant's alehouse became the craftsman's tavern, and the drunken songs of the fields were replaced by the quieter murmur of conversation. The old highs, the ecstatic dances, the hallucinatory ointments, the flying witches and weeping saints faded into legend, stories to be told but not lived. In the great cities of Europe, new stimulants began to appear. Coffee and tea arrived from distant lands, offering alertness instead of oblivion. Tobacco, brought from the New World, spread like wildfire through courts and taverns alike. These new substances carried a different kind of intoxication, clean, quick, and acceptable. They sharpened rather than blurred. They belonged to a new age of clarity, reason, and commerce. To the old mystics, this might have seemed like the dimming of the world's magic, but to the thinkers of the time, it was progress. Still, not everyone was content with reason alone. Poets and philosophers lamented the loss of wonder. They looked back on the old ways, on the monks who dreamed in candlelight, the witches who flew through visions, and the peasants who sang beneath the stars, with a strange nostalgia. The medieval world had been full of mystery, they said, even in its suffering. To feel intoxication, then, was to feel connected to the divine, to the earth, to something larger than oneself. The modern world, for all its light, seemed somehow lonelier. By the 16th century, witch trials and heresy hunts had stamped out much of the old experimentation with hallucinogenic herbs and mystical trances. What had once been curiosity became danger. The Church, frightened by rebellion and reform, doubled down on control. The herbalists who survived did so quietly, disguising their knowledge as medicine. The dreamers, too, retreated, their ecstasies replaced by silent prayer. The world grew sober, disciplined, and cautious. And yet, beneath that surface of order, the desire never died. The same longing that had led peasants to drink and monks to chant still burned quietly in the hearts of men and women. The New Age simply found new outlets: the artist's imagination, the philosopher's inquiry, the wanderer's search for discovery. In place of potions and incense came art, exploration, and invention. The human spirit still reached for transcendence, only now it called it inspiration. The decline of the old highs was not a loss of wonder, but a transformation. The medieval world had sought escape through faith and feeling. The modern world would seek it through knowledge and creation. What remained constant was the yearning, that deep, unshakable part of the human soul that cannot bear to stay still. Whether through a cup of ale, a whispered prayer, or a page of poetry, people continued to reach for that same fleeting moment of connection beyond themselves. And though the monasteries grew quiet and the flying witches vanished into memory, the echoes of their world endured. In the scent of incense, in the warmth of a drink, in the shiver of a song, the medieval high still lingers, a reminder that long before science named its chemicals and society measured its pleasures, humanity was already chasing the same timeless dream, to feel more alive than life itself. In the next and final chapter, we'll look at how the ghosts of these old highs still follow us today, how the medieval search for transcendence shaped modern attitudes toward pleasure, faith, and escape, and why even now we're still reaching for the same ancient fire. Though centuries have passed since the last medieval monk brewed his herbal elixir, or the last peasant sang through the haze of ale by firelight, the echoes of those ancient highs still hum quietly beneath the surface of our modern lives. The tools have changed. The glass replaced the goblet, the laboratory replaced the apothecary, but the longing remains the same. Humanity still yearns to rise above the weight of existence, to drift for a moment into stillness, warmth, or wonder. Whether we find it in music, meditation, or modern chemistry, it is the same old search, the desire to feel beyond the limits of flesh and fear. In the modern world, our understanding of intoxication has become both sharper and more conflicted. We dissect chemicals, measure doses, and speak in the language of neurotransmitters and receptors. We call it science now, not sorcery, yet for all our knowledge, the mystery persists. When someone closes their eyes after a glass of wine and feels the warmth spread through their chest, or when a crowd moves as one beneath the pulse of music, something ancient stirs, the same impulse that led monks into trances and peasants into dance. Beneath the surface of modernity, the medieval spirit still whispers, to lose oneself is to remember the soul. The substances of the past never truly vanished. They simply evolved. The poppy still blooms, though now its sap is processed, refined, and labeled. The herbs once used by witches are studied in laboratories for their medicinal value. Even incense, once the scent of sanctity, fills homes not for prayer but for peace. Each carries the same quiet magic, the power to shift the mind, to soften the edges of the world, to connect us to something larger, even if we no longer call it divine. But our relationship with these sensations has changed. The medieval world accepted mystery. It embraced the idea that pleasure and danger were intertwined. Today, we crave control, precision, safety, predictability. We want the effect without the uncertainty. Yet in doing so, perhaps we have lost a small piece of wonder. The monks who brewed beer by candlelight, or the healers who mixed herbs by instinct, worked not just with ingredients, but with faith. They believed that every intoxication was a conversation with the world itself, a dialogue between body, spirit, and nature. Now we call it recreation, but once it was revelation. Even our culture of celebration bears the stamp of the past. When we gather for festivals, raise glasses to toast, or light candles to mark important days, we echo those same medieval feasts where ale and song bound communities together. The laughter that spills from bars and weddings is not so different from the laughter that filled the old taverns and fields. Humanity's rituals have shifted form, but not essence. Every shared drink, every deep breath of scented air, every moment when the world feels brighter than usual, they are all remnants of a very old inheritance. The Church's warnings about excess, too, still linger in our modern morals. Society continues to struggle with the same questions that haunted the medieval conscience. When does pleasure become sin? When does escape become addiction? The battle between indulgence and restraint, between surrender and control, is eternal. Medieval Europe wrapped those questions in faith. Today, we wrap them in science and policy. But the heart of the struggle remains unchanged. The need to balance the comfort of oblivion with the clarity of living. Yet even now, in an age of machines and reason, we still seek transcendence through the senses. Some find it in music that makes the world fall away. Others in meditation, or in art, or in the quiet burn of wine on the tongue. The forms have multiplied, but the purpose has not changed. We are all, in some way, heirs to that medieval longing, the wish to slip beyond the walls of our bodies, to taste a little of eternity, even if only for a breath. Perhaps that is the great truth that history reveals, that the need to feel, to dream, and to escape is not a flaw, but a feature of being human. The peasants who drank by firelight, the monks who prayed into ecstasy, the witches who rubbed their flying ointments beneath the moon, they were all reaching for the same fragile, beautiful thing that we still reach for today: connection, wonder, relief. Though the centuries have changed our tools and language, the yearning remains untouched. In every age, we have sought our own versions of the medieval high, through faith, through art, through love, through science. We are still chasing that ancient shimmer between body and spirit, that fleeting sensation of being both here and somewhere else. In that way, the story of medieval intoxication is not a tale of the past at all. It is the story of us, the endless, restless search for meaning, for comfort, for transcendence in a world that so often feels too heavy to bear. The Middle Ages have ended, but the dream that burned in their shadows still glows quietly within us. It lives in the sigh before sleep, in the scent of smoke, in the warmth of shared drink, and in the secret wish that, for just a moment, we might feel more than human. And so, our journey through the intoxicating heart of the Middle Ages comes to an end. From the smoky taverns of the peasantry to the candlelit silence of monasteries, from witches' cauldrons to cathedral incense, we have seen that the medieval experience of getting high was never just about pleasure. It was about meaning. In a world ruled by faith, hardship, and mystery, people turned to drink, herbs, song, and prayer, not only to escape, but to connect. Every cup of ale, every fragrant cloud of incense, every whispered spell beneath the moonlight was a way of saying the same thing. Life was heavy, but the human spirit could still rise. It's easy to look back and smile at how little they knew, at how superstition blurred their understanding of chemistry and mind. But in truth, the medieval people were chasing something we still chase today. They sought warmth in a cold world, comfort in uncertainty, and a glimpse of wonder in the dark. Their ways may have been crude, their dangers real, but their yearning was universal. Whether through holy visions or herbal dreams, they reached toward that timeless need to feel something greater than themselves. As we leave this world of monks, mystics, and merrymakers, it's worth remembering that history isn't a story of progress alone. It is a mirror. The medieval person staring into the flames after a long day sipping a cup of ale and feeling their thoughts drift. would recognize the same quiet search that fills our own hearts when we turn to music art or meditation for peace. Across the centuries, the human longing for transcendence hasn't dimmed. It has only changed its form. So as you drift to sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine the soft hum of a medieval tavern somewhere in the distance, the laughter, the music, the smell of smoke and honey. Imagine the monks chanting in candlelight, the incense curling like a dream through the air. Imagine that long-ago world where even the simplest souls sought, in their own way, to rise above the weight of the world. Thank you for listening to History for Sleep. If you enjoyed this journey through the strange and beautiful world of medieval intoxication, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you can drift off with more stories from the forgotten corners of the past. And in the comments, tell us what era or mystery of history you'd like to dream about next, and when you listen in. Do you fall asleep right at the beginning, or stay awake until the very end? Whatever your answer, we're glad you're here, a fellow traveler through time, chasing wonder one whisper at a time. Now, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let history carry you into dreams. The night is waiting, and the story never truly ends.